The mansion's kitchen staff had 3 unspoken rules that kept them alive in Dorian Kane's world. Never ask questions about the blood on his shirts, never enter the East Wing after midnight, and never, under any circumstances, go near Brutus. The Rottweiler had sent 2 trainers to the hospital and made a veteran handler quit the profession entirely within his first month at the estate. Isla Brennan learned about the 3rd rule approximately 40 seconds before she broke it, her arms loaded with fresh linens as she rounded the marble corridor on her first morning. The head housekeeper's warning still hung in the air, when a sound like grinding metal mixed with primal fury erupted from behind the reinforced steel door ahead. She froze, watching the door shudder against its frame as something massive threw its weight against the barrier. The lock mechanisms groaned under repeated impacts that seemed impossible for any living creature to sustain without injury. "That's the boss's dog," whispered Margot, the senior maid who'd been assigned to train her. "Cost him $200,000 at some underground auction 3 years ago. Thing's got a taste for violence that makes the boss look gentle." The crashes stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, absolute silence that felt predatory, as if whatever lived behind that door was now listening. Isla's fingers tightened on the linens, her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. Then came a sound she hadn't heard in 7 years, a specific pattern of breathing followed by a low whine that bypassed her brain entirely and struck somewhere deeper. Her hands went numb, the sheets tumbling to the polished floor in a cascade of white. "You all right?" Margot reached for her elbow, but Isla was already moving toward the door, her body operating on instinct that overrode common sense and self-preservation. The breathing pattern repeated, 3 short exhales, a pause, then a longer exhale that ended in that same distinctive whine. She'd heard it 1,000 times when Brutus was a puppy, always when he was anxious or seeking comfort in the small apartment she'd shared with her mother. "What are you doing?" Margot's voice pitched higher as Isla's hand found the door handle. "Are you insane? That animal will tear you apart before you can scream." But Isla was already turning the lock, her fingers trembling as 7 years of grief and desperate hope collided in her chest. The mechanisms clicked open with finality that felt like crossing a threshold from which there was no return. The door swung inward to reveal a space that resembled a luxury prison cell more than a dog's quarters. Reinforced walls, scratch marks gouged deep into custom woodwork, and a massive Rottweiler chained to a bolt in the floor. The dog's head snapped toward her, lips pulling back from teeth designed to crush bone. He was enormous, easily 130 pounds of pure muscle and controlled aggression, his black coat gleaming under recessed lighting that made the scars crossing his shoulders look like war paint. The characteristic rust-colored markings on his chest and paws were darker than she remembered, matured from puppy fuzz to adult intimidation. But it was the small scar above his left eye that made her knees buckle, a tiny imperfection from when he'd bumped into a coffee table corner at 8 weeks old, requiring 3 careful stitches from a veterinarian who'd worked on payment plans. She'd held him through that procedure, singing softly until his puppy whimpers subsided. "Brutus," she whispered, and the name felt like resurrection, like speaking life back into something she'd mourned as dead. The dog's snarl faltered, his massive head tilting with confusion that would have been comical if not for the very real danger radiating from every tense muscle. His ears, cropped into aggressive points by someone who'd understood his value as a weapon, twitched forward with something that looked almost like recognition. Behind her, Margot was calling for security, her voice panicked and distant, but Isla couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at the impossible reunion unfolding in this gilded cage. She'd searched for 6 months after the theft, posting flyers until her mother's death from cancer had consumed everything else. The Rottweiler took 1 step forward, chain rattling with the movement, his nose working to process her scent across the 15 feet separating them. Whatever he found there made his entire body language shift from attack-ready to something more complex, confusion mixing with an instinct he couldn't quite name. Somewhere in the mansion's depths, footsteps were approaching at a run, but Isla was already sinking to her knees on the cold floor, her voice breaking as she began to hum the lullaby her mother had taught her, the same melody that had soothed Brutus through thunderstorms and fireworks, and the general anxiety of puppyhood in a chaotic world. The melody emerged broken and rough, 7 years of grief sharpening its edges, but the core remained unchanged, a simple Irish lullaby her grandmother had carried across an ocean. Isla's voice cracked on the 3rd note, tears blurring her vision as she watched Brutus's massive body go completely still. His ears rotated forward with laser focus, the aggressive tension draining from his shoulders in a way that seemed to defy his conditioning. The chain went slack as he sat back on his haunches, his enormous head tilting further with canine bewilderment. She continued humming through her tears, muscle memory guiding her through verses she hadn't sung since the night before he disappeared from their apartment's tiny balcony. Someone had cut through the lock while she slept, professional enough to leave no trace except emptiness. Brutus's tail moved once, a tentative sweep against the floor that looked foreign on an animal trained for violence. His mouth closed, the display of teeth replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable, as if layers of brutal conditioning were peeling away with each note. What the hell is happening? The voice came from the doorway, male and carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate answers. Step away from that dog right now. Isla didn't turn, couldn't risk breaking whatever fragile connection was rebuilding between them. She transitioned from humming to soft words, the lullaby's Gaelic verses flowing despite her limited Irish, purely phonetic memory from childhood. Brutus rose slowly, his movements careful rather than aggressive, and began walking toward her with the chain dragging behind him. Each step was measured, cautious, as if he was approaching something sacred he couldn't quite believe existed. I said step away. The command was sharper now, closer, but still Isla remained frozen, her hands extending palm up in invitation as Brutus closed the distance to 10 feet, then 8, then 6. She could see the scars more clearly now, evidence of fights he'd survived or been forced into, marks of a life that had nothing to do with the gentle puppy who'd once fallen asleep in her lap. Rage flickered through her grief, hot and sudden, at whoever had done this to him. Brutus stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. His nose extended toward her hands, nostrils flaring as he processed scent markers that shouldn't exist, that contradicted everything his violent world had taught him. The first touch of his wet nose against her palm sent electricity through her entire body. His eyes, deep brown and intelligent beyond any animal she'd encountered since, locked onto hers with recognition that transcended training or conditioning. "That's impossible," the male voice said, much quieter now, stripped of command and replaced with something like wonder. He tried to kill the last person who got within 8 feet of him. Isla's fingers found the scar above Brutus's left eye, tracing the familiar ridge of tissue with trembling gentleness. His entire body leaned into the touch, a sound emerging from deep in his chest that was neither growl nor whine, but something closer to relief. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling his weight settle against her as if 7 years hadn't passed, as if the theft and training and violence had been nothing but nightmare. His body was different, harder, scarred, transformed into weapon, but the soul pressing against her was the same puppy who'd chosen her at a shelter adoption event. "Who are you?" The question held genuine confusion now, and Isla finally looked up to see the man in the doorway, tall, probably early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that carried their own collection of scars despite their physical perfection. Dorian Kane looked exactly like the photographs she'd seen in the head housekeeper's briefing, dangerously handsome in the way of men who'd never had to ask permission for anything, dressed in casual clothing that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. But his expression was unguarded in this moment, shock making him almost human. "I'm Isla Brennan," she managed, her voice rough with emotion as Brutus pressed closer, his bulk nearly toppling her backward. "And this is my dog." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and absolute, while Brutus's tail began a proper wag that sent his entire back end swaying. In the background, security personnel had arrived but remained frozen in the doorway, witnessing something that shouldn't exist in their carefully controlled world. Dorian's office occupied the mansion's top floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture that screamed wealth through absence rather than excess. Isla sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than her mother's entire medical debt, Brutus's massive head resting on her knee with proprietary comfort. "You have exactly 5 minutes to explain how you tamed an animal I've spent 3 years trying to control." Dorian remained standing, positioned between her and the door in a posture that was probably unconscious intimidation. "And your story better be exceptional." She studied him properly now, noting the way his eyes tracked every movement she made with Brutus, analyzing and cataloging like a man who survived by reading threats before they materialized. His fingers drummed once against his thigh before going deliberately still. "I didn't tame him," Isla said, her hand moving in slow strokes down Brutus's scarred shoulder. "I raised him, from 8 weeks old until someone stole him from my apartment 7 years ago." Dorian's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, calculation mixing with what might have been doubt. He moved to the window, staring out at Philadelphia's sprawling cityscape with his back to her. I acquired Brutus from a private auction 3 years ago, he said, his tone carefully neutral. The seller claimed he came from Eastern European fighting rings, bred specifically for aggression and pain tolerance. Isla felt cold rage crystallize in her chest, sharpening her words. The seller lied. Brutus was born in a shelter in South Philadelphia. His mother was a Rottweiler mix who'd been rescued from a hoarding situation. You can prove this? Dorian turned back, and his eyes were different now, harder, focused with the intensity of someone who'd just identified a potential threat or opportunity. She lifted Brutus's right front paw, showing the pad that was slightly lighter than the others. He stepped on broken glass when he was 4 months old. The vet said the scar tissue would always be visible if you knew where to look. Dorian crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the chair with fluid grace that suggested combat training. He examined Brutus's paw with clinical precision, his fingers surprisingly gentle as they traced the scar tissue Isla had indicated. The scar above his eye, Isla continued, happened when he bumped into my coffee table at 8 weeks. 3 stitches, and if you check his left ear, there's a small notch from where my neighbor's cat caught him when he was being too friendly. Each detail landed like evidence in a trial, and she watched Dorian's face as he verified every claim, his expression growing darker with each confirmation. Brutus remained calm throughout the examination, his trust in her presence overriding years of defensive conditioning. Someone stole your dog and sold him into fighting rings, Dorian said finally, rising to his full height. His voice carried an edge that made her suddenly aware of why people feared him. Then he was rescued, by a middleman who auctions animals to collectors like me. Isla nodded, her throat tight with 7 years of unanswered questions. She'd reported the theft to police who'd barely filed a report, searched shelters for months until her mother's illness consumed everything, never imagining Brutus would end up in the possession of Philadelphia's most dangerous man. How did you end up working in my household? Dorian asked, and the question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. This was a man who survived by trusting nothing coincidental. The agency sent me, Isla said, meeting his eyes directly. I needed work after my mother died last year. I had no idea Brutus was here until I heard him through that door. Dorian studied her for a long moment, and she could practically see him analyzing angles, searching for deception or hidden agenda. Brutus shifted his weight, pressing more firmly against her leg, as if offering support. You're either the most elaborate plant I've ever encountered, Dorian said slowly, or this is the strangest coincidence in my entire career. He moved to his desk, extracting a crystal decanter and pouring amber liquid into a single glass. The silence stretched while he drank, his eyes never leaving her face. Isla forced herself to remain still, to not fidget or look away, instinctively understanding that showing weakness now would be catastrophic. I'm going to make you an offer, Dorian said finally, setting down the glass with precise control. You work exclusively with Brutus. No other household duties. Triple your current salary. You train him, you care for him, and you help me understand how an animal I couldn't control becomes docile the moment you sing to him. Isla's mind raced through implications, recognizing opportunity mixed with danger. Working directly for Dorian Kane meant entering his world more deeply, accepting proximity to violence and moral compromise she'd spent her life avoiding. But Brutus's weight against her leg was real, solid, the reunion she'd stopped dreaming about years ago because the pain was too sharp. The thought of walking away now, of leaving him again, was physically impossible. I want full medical care for him, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Proper veterinary evaluation, treatment for any lingering injuries from the fights, and I want to know who stole him. Something like respect flickered across Dorian's face, brief as lightning but unmistakable. He extended his hand across the desk, an old-fashioned gesture that somehow carried more weight than any contract. We have a deal, Miss Brennan, he said, but understand this. In my world, loyalty runs deeper than blood. If you're working this close to me, I need to trust you completely. Betrayal doesn't end with termination. Isla took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of violence despite his polished appearance, and understood she was crossing a threshold that would change everything. Brutus's tail thumped against the chair leg, oblivious to the dangerous bargain being struck above his head. The East Wing became Isla's domain over the following weeks, transformed from prison into sanctuary through changes both practical and profound. She requisitioned softer bedding, natural light exposure, and structured routine that replaced chaos with predictability Brutus had never known in Dorian's care. The Rottweiler's transformation wasn't immediate or magical. It was earned through patient hours of undoing damage that went bone deep. Each morning she arrived before dawn, sitting quietly in his space until he approached on his own terms, rebuilding trust that violence had shattered. Dorian watched from security cameras initially, Isla discovered when she noticed the lens adjustments tracking her movements. She didn't acknowledge the surveillance. Understanding it was how he maintained control in a world where trust was currency more valuable than money. By the third week, Brutus was taking food from her hand without the aggressive resource guarding that had made feeding him dangerous. His weight increased as stress diminished, the hollows in his flanks filling out with proper nutrition and reduced cortisol. The physical changes reflected deeper healing, muscles relaxing from constant defensive tension into something approaching normal canine existence. She introduced enrichment activities that engaged his intelligence rather than just his aggression, puzzle feeders that required problem-solving, scent work that utilized his natural tracking abilities, games that rewarded gentle behavior over violent responses. His eyes began to brighten with curiosity that had been beaten out through brutal conditioning. Each small victory felt monumental, proof that damage wasn't always permanent. The household staff stopped giving her wide berth by week 4, their fear replaced with fascinated observation of the impossible taming. Margot started bringing coffee to the East Wing, lingering to watch Brutus respond to commands in what looked like a completely different language than violence. Other staff members found excuses to pass by during training sessions, witnessing transformation that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Dorian's direct observations began during the 2nd month, his presence announced by Italian leather shoes on marble floors, and the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded powerful men. He never entered Brutus's space initially, maintaining distance that respected boundaries while his dark eyes catalogued every interaction. His focus was absolute, studying her techniques with the same intensity he probably applied to business negotiations or tactical planning. "You're teaching him to be soft," Dorian said one morning, his tone unreadable as he watched Brutus roll onto his back for belly rubs. The words carried neither approval nor disapproval, just observation weighted with implications Isla was beginning to recognize. That's dangerous in my world. Vulnerability gets exploited. Gentleness gets mistaken for weakness. Isla continued her gentle strokes along Brutus's scarred abdomen, not looking up immediately. "I'm teaching him he doesn't have to be a weapon every moment of every day. There's a difference between soft and having the choice to be gentle." She finally met Dorian's gaze, holding it with confidence that surprised them both. Real strength includes knowing when violence isn't necessary. The silence that followed felt weighted with more than conversation about dog training. When she finally studied Dorian's face properly, something complex moved behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the uncomfortable mirror of seeing his own captivity reflected in animal form. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction to words that had clearly struck deeper than intended. "Show me," he said abruptly, gesturing toward the training equipment she'd installed. "Teach me what you're doing with him. I want to understand how you're achieving results that professional trainers with decades of experience couldn't manage." The request carried vulnerability that seemed foreign to his nature, admission that he didn't have all answers. The request surprised her more than anything he'd said since their deal was struck. Dorian Kane didn't ask for instruction. He commanded, controlled, dominated every space he occupied. Vulnerability wasn't in his vocabulary. Yet here he was requesting guidance from a 20-year-old former waitress who'd stumbled into his world through impossible coincidence. Isla stood slowly, brushing dog hair from her jeans with deliberate movements that gave her time to process the shift in their dynamic. It starts with understanding that everything he does is communication. The aggression wasn't random. It was language. She moved to Brutus's side, demonstrating her posture and energy. Fear, pain, lack of control, all translated into violence because that was the only dialect he'd been taught by people who valued him as weapon rather than living being. She demonstrated basic calming signals, showing how Brutus responded to soft eye contact, slow movements, and the specific tone of voice that signaled safety rather than threat. Dorian absorbed the lesson with intensity that suggested he was learning more than just dog training, his focus absolute in the way of men who survived by gathering information others missed. "Your turn," Isla said, stepping back and gesturing for Dorian to take her place. She caught his momentary hesitation, so brief most people would miss it, before he moved forward with the decisive grace that characterized all his actions. The hesitation revealed more than confidence ever could. This man feared very little, but genuine connection apparently qualified as threatening. Brutus's ears flattened slightly as Dorian approached. his body tensing with muscle memory of masculine authority that historically preceded pain. The Rottweiler's eyes tracked to Isla, seeking confirmation or escape route with canine intelligence that understood power dynamics better than most humans. His breathing quickened, stress signals rippling through his massive frame despite weeks of rehabilitation. "Lower your shoulders," Isla instructed softly, moving closer to provide guidance. "You carry tension like armor, defensive posture that's probably kept you alive in countless situations." But he can feel it from 6 feet away and interprets it as threat, as precursor to violence based on everything his experience has taught him about men who stand like you're standing. Dorian's jaw tightened, visible effort required to relax the rigid posture that probably kept him alive in countless dangerous situations. His shoulders dropped fractionally, and Brutus's tail gave a tentative wag, responding to the subtle shift in energy. The change was minimal by external observation, but represented seismic internal adjustment for a man who'd built identity on appearing invulnerable. "Now offer your hand palm down, fingers loose and relaxed." No fist. Fists mean violence in his experience, precursor to pain every single time. Everything about your body language needs to communicate safety, rather than dominance. Isla demonstrated the position, noting how Dorian studied her hand, like it contained secrets to languages he'd never learned to speak. Dorian extended his hand with surprising gentleness, mimicking her position with precision that spoke to his ability to adapt and learn. After a long moment of canine deliberation where Brutus's nose worked to process contradictory information, the dog stretched his neck forward to sniff. The contact lasted only seconds before Brutus retreated, but triumph flashed across Dorian's face with unexpected boyishness that transformed his usually controlled features. "He's never let me touch him voluntarily," Dorian said, wonder softening his usually controlled voice into something almost vulnerable. 3 years of trying everything I knew, every technique professional handlers suggested, thousands spent on training programs that failed, and you've accomplished in weeks what I couldn't manage in years." The admission cost him something, visible in the tightness around his eyes. Isla watched something shift in the dynamic between man and animal, recognizing the precise moment when Dorian stopped seeing Brutus as weapon or possession and started seeing him as living being capable of choice and trust. It was the same shift she needed Dorian to make about his own humanity, about the difference between surviving through force and actually living through connection. Isla began her private investigation on a Wednesday, using her afternoon break to access the mansion's business office under the pretense of reviewing her employment contract. The administrative assistant, a nervous young man named Timothy, barely glanced up as she settled into a corner desk with laptop and carefully casual demeanor. Her heart hammered against ribs, but her expression remained professionally neutral, a skill she'd developed through years of service work. The mansion's records were surprisingly accessible once she understood the filing system. Dorian's confidence in his security apparently extended to assuming no household staff would dare snoop through documents. She found the acquisition documents for Brutus within an hour, buried in a folder labeled Asset Acquisitions 2022, alongside artwork purchases and real estate holdings. The casual categorization of her stolen dog, alongside inanimate objects, made rage simmer low in her stomach. The auction house name meant nothing initially. Meridian Estate Sales, operating out of a warehouse district address that could have been anywhere in Philadelphia's industrial zones. But the seller's name made her hands shake so badly she nearly dropped her phone. Carson Webb, listed as procurement specialist with a local phone number still in active service. The same Carson Webb who served as Dorian's director of security operations, trusted position with access to everything. She photographed the documents with trembling fingers, capturing every detail including the purchase price that made her nauseous. $200,000 for a dog stolen from a grieving teenager's balcony, transformed into commodity through violence and exploitation. The number represented more money than her mother had earned in 5 years of exhausting work before cancer consumed everything. Timothy's sudden throat clearing made her jump, guilt flashing hot across her face before she controlled it. But he was only warning her that Margot was approaching down the hallway, giving her precious seconds to close the files and pull up the generic employment handbook. Her pulse gradually slowed as Margot passed without incident, chatting on her phone about dinner plans that felt absurdly normal against Isla's churning discovery. That evening in Brutus's space, she searched Carson Webb's name and found a LinkedIn profile showing him as Director of Security Operations for Kane Industries, Dorian's legitimate business front. The man who'd sold Dorian his own stolen dog worked directly for him in position of significant trust, had access to everything from financial records to personal schedules. The betrayal's scope expanded with each detail she uncovered, revealing operation far more sophisticated than simple theft. Her fingers buried in Brutus's fur as rage crystallized into something colder and more focused than simple anger. Carson hadn't just stolen a dog 7 years ago. He'd built an entire side business trafficking animals while drawing substantial salary from the man he was systematically betraying. The audacity was staggering, the cruelty casual in ways that suggested this wasn't aberration but core character trait. "You're thinking loud thoughts," Dorian's voice came from the doorway, making her start, despite weeks of growing accustomed to his unannounced observations. His ability to move silently through his own mansion was unsettling, product of skills she didn't want to examine too closely. "What did you discover that's making your breathing change and your shoulders tense like you're preparing for confrontation?" Isla's mind raced through options faster than conscious thought. Lie and protect herself from entanglement in his dangerous world. Tell truth and risk variables she couldn't control. Or some middle path that might serve justice without triggering the violence she knew he was capable of. She studied Dorian's face in the low lighting, searching for clues about which version of him stood in the doorway, the careful teacher of gentle handling, or the ruthless crime lord. "I found the acquisition documents for Brutus," she said finally, choosing honesty weighted with careful calibration. "The auction house details, the seller's name, the complete paper trail of how he ended up in your possession. I wanted to understand the full scope of what happened, needed to know who took him from me, and how the theft connected to everything that came after." Dorian entered fully, closing the door behind him with quiet finality that changed the room's entire energy. His expression was unreadable in the way she'd learned meant deep calculation occurring beneath surface calm, deciding in real time how to respond to information that shifted their established dynamic. Tension coiled in his shoulders despite weeks of her teaching him to recognize and release defensive posture. "And what did these documents tell you?" His voice carried dangerous curiosity, the precise tone of man deciding whether witness becomes accomplice or liability in his world. He moved closer, not threateningly, but with predatory awareness that made her conscious of every escape route and barrier. The question held layers, testing her honesty, her intelligence, her understanding of the dangerous ground she'd chosen to walk. Isla met his eyes directly, refusing to show the fear pumping adrenaline through her veins despite every survival instinct screaming to back down. "That Carson Webb sold you my dog 3 years ago for $200,000. That he's still on your payroll in a position of significant trust with access to sensitive information. That the man you rely on for security has been running operations directly under your nose, while you paid him handsomely for the privilege." The silence stretched so long she could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Brutus's confusion at the tension suddenly filling his carefully constructed safe space. Dorian's face remained perfectly neutral, but his hands curled into fists before deliberately relaxing, conscious control that spoke to the rage he was containing. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet in the way that was infinitely more frightening than shouting. "You've done background research on my security director," he said slowly, each word precise as surgical instrument cutting through pretense. "Accessed files you had no authorization to view. Investigated a man who has resources and willingness to eliminate problems permanently. That's either remarkably brave or catastrophically stupid, and I'm genuinely uncertain which assessment is accurate." "It's neither," Isla countered, her voice steadier than her nerves justified. "It's necessary. You asked me to help you understand Brutus, to explain how an animal conditioned for violence could choose gentleness instead. Part of that understanding is knowing who hurt him and why, tracing the full scope of damage back to its source." She paused, letting her next words land with full weight. "And if Carson did this to Brutus, he's done it to countless other animals. This isn't isolated incident. It's business model." Dorian moved to the window. His back to her and posture she was learning meant deep calculation occurring behind carefully maintained exterior calm. The city lights beyond painted his profile in sharp relief, making him look carved from stone rather than flesh and blood. His reflection in the glass showed expression she couldn't fully read, mixture of fury and something that might have been respect. "Carson has been with me for 8 years, Dorian said finally, words emerging like they cost him something to speak. "He's prevented 2 attempts on my life, managed security for operations across 4 states, earned trust through demonstrated loyalty in situations that would break most men. I've trusted him with information that could destroy me if it reached wrong hands." The admission of potential misjudgment clearly pained him in ways physical injury probably never could. Isla heard the conflict in his words. The man who survived by reading people with perfect accuracy, confronting evidence that his judgment had failed catastrophically where it mattered most. She rose slowly, approaching him with the same careful energy she used with Brutus in early days of rebuilding trust. Her hand found his arm, contact that crossed professional boundaries, but felt necessary to anchor them both through this revelation. "I'm not asking you to take immediate action or make decisions based solely on my word," she said quietly, choosing each word with precision. "I'm telling you what I found because you deserve to know, because operating with incomplete information is what got us here. What you do with this knowledge is entirely your choice, but you'll make that choice with full awareness rather than continued ignorance." Her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. "And I need you to understand. If Carson did this systematically, there are other victims, other families destroyed, other animals tortured. This goes far beyond Brutus and me." The moment crystallized between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond stolen dog or betrayed trust. This was test and offer simultaneously. Her proving she could navigate his dangerous world with integrity he rarely encountered, him deciding whether to trust information that contradicted years of established relationship. The weight of mutual vulnerability felt unprecedented, connection forged through shared mission that transcended their vastly different worlds. The next 2 weeks transformed Isla's role from dog trainer to unlikely investigator, working alongside Dorian in late-night sessions that felt increasingly intimate, despite their professional focus. They mapped Carson's movements through financial records, security logs, and surveillance footage that revealed patterns invisible when examined in isolation. The mansion's study became their war room, documents spreading across mahogany surfaces while Brutus sprawled between them, his presence somehow making the dangerous work feel safer. Dorian taught her to read the subtle signs of deception in business records, unexplained gaps in timelines, vendors that existed only on paper, expenses that didn't align with operational needs. His world operated on different rules than hers, but his intelligence was undeniable, sharp and focused in ways that made her understand how he'd built an empire. He explained money laundering techniques and shell corporation structures with the casual expertise of someone who'd mastered both sides of legal boundaries. She contributed perspective he lacked, the human element of trafficking operations, the way stolen pets moved through underground markets, the specific red flags in Carson's documented animal acquisitions that Dorian's financial focus had missed. Together they built a case that became irrefutable, each piece of evidence connecting to form picture of systematic betrayal spanning years. The collaboration revealed complementary skills neither had recognized initially, creating investigative partnership more effective than either could manage alone. "He's been running the operation for at least 6 years, Dorian said one night, his voice tight with controlled fury as new evidence emerged from encrypted files they'd finally cracked. "Using my resources, my reputation, my infrastructure to traffic animals across state lines for fighting rings and private collectors. Every acquisition I authorized for legitimate security purposes, he corrupted into cover for his side business." His fist came down on the desk hard enough to make Brutus's ears twitch. Isla watched anger transform his features, making him look dangerous in ways that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't anymore. She'd learned to distinguish between his capacity for violence and his choice to employ it, a distinction she suspected few people in his life understood or even recognized as relevant. The fury in his eyes was righteous rather than casual, directed at genuine betrayal rather than mere inconvenience. The breaking point came when they discovered Carson's personal financial records through methods Isla didn't ask about, and Dorian didn't explain. Accounts in the Cayman Islands showing deposits totaling over $2 million, all traceable to animal trafficking operations that had destroyed countless lives beyond just Brutus. The scope was staggering, revealing enterprise that had flourished under Dorian's nose while he'd trusted completely. Each transaction represented animal stolen, family devastated, life destroyed for profit. "I want to confront him," Dorian said, his tone leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "But I need proof he can't deny. Evidence so solid he'll confess just to maintain some illusion of control over his own exposure. Carson's smart enough to have contingency plans, insurance policies against exactly this scenario." His fingers drummed against the desk, strategic mind already working through possibilities. If we move too soon, or without overwhelming proof, he'll activate whatever safeguards he's established. Isla's mind worked through possibilities, understanding they'd reached the phase where planning became action, and theory transformed into confrontation. Her hands found Brutus's ears, seeking comfort in his solid presence as she voiced the dangerous idea forming. The Rottweiler leaned into her touch, grounding her through contact as she prepared to suggest something that would put them all at risk. "Use Brutus as bait," she said quietly, the words emerging despite every self-preservation instinct screaming to stay silent. "Carson doesn't know I've reconnected with him. Doesn't know the dog he sold you is actually mine. He thinks Brutus is just another of your assets, another weapon you've acquired and failed to control properly. Set up a meeting about acquiring another animal, something rare and expensive enough to make Carson handle it personally, rather than delegating to subordinates." Dorian's eyes sharpened with predatory interest, his mind clearly racing ahead to see the plan's full potential. "And you'll be there with Brutus, ostensibly demonstrating the training techniques you've been using. When Carson sees the dog responding to you with recognition and trust, he'll panic." His voice gained momentum as strategic possibilities unfolded. He might reveal information trying to explain away the connection, or his reaction alone will confirm guilt in ways that can't be walked back. "More than that," Isla continued, warming to the plan despite its risks, despite the way it would put her directly in Carson's crosshairs. "I'll pretend to be a potential buyer you're vetting, someone interested in acquiring trained protection animals through legitimate channels. Carson won't recognize me. I was 13 when he stole Brutus, probably just another face in whatever operation he was running back then. My appearance has changed enough that unless he's expecting me specifically, I'll register as stranger." Her pulse accelerated with combination of fear and determination. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility, and danger equally balanced, like standing at cliff edge deciding whether to jump. Dorian studied her with intensity that made her skin warm, his gaze cataloging not just her words but motivations beneath them, reading her with the same precision he applied to business negotiations. His focus was absolute, making her feel simultaneously exposed and seen in ways she'd never experienced. "This puts you directly in potential danger that I can mitigate but not eliminate entirely," he said finally, and the concern in his voice felt genuine rather than strategic. "Carson isn't just a thief operating on small scale. He's eliminated problems before when his operations were threatened. If he feels cornered, his response won't be civilized conversation or negotiated settlement. He'll escalate to violence without hesitation if he perceives existential threat." The warning carried weight of experience, of understanding exactly how dangerous men operated when desperate. Isla straightened her spine, meeting his concern with resolution she'd been building through weeks of reclaiming power stolen along with her dog. "I've been in danger since the moment I recognized Brutus and started asking questions that threatened Carson's operation. At least this way, I'm choosing to face it rather than waiting for it to find me on his timeline." Her voice carried conviction that surprised them both. "I spent 7 years feeling powerless about what happened. I'm done with powerless." Something shifted in Dorian's expression, admiration mixing with what might have been affection, though she didn't trust herself to name it accurately given their complicated dynamic. His hand reached out, hovering near her face before dropping, the almost touch somehow more intimate than actual contact would have been. The air between them felt charged with electricity, tension that had nothing to do with investigation or revenge, and everything to do with connection they'd been dancing around for weeks. "You're nothing like I expected when you first walked into Brutus's space," he said softly, words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. "When you entered my life through sheer coincidence, I thought you'd be another complication to manage, another variable requiring control. Instead, you're someone who challenges everything I thought I understood about strength and vulnerability." His eyes held hers with intensity that made breathing difficult. "You've made me question whether the walls I've built for protection are actually prison keeping me isolated from anything real." The confession hung between them like physical presence, raw honesty that seemed foreign to a man who'd built empire on calculated control. Isla felt her heart rate accelerate for reasons having nothing to do with fear or danger, heat rising in her cheeks as she processed what he was actually saying beneath diplomatic language. "Instead, I'm what?" she prompted, her voice barely above whisper, needing him to say it clearly despite knowing the answer. The space between them felt simultaneously too large and dangerously small, charged with possibility that terrified and attracted her in equal measure. Brutus's tail thumped against the floor, canine obliviousness breaking tension without fully dispersing it. "Someone who makes me want things I convinced myself were impossible in my world," Dorian finished, and the raw honesty in his words struck deeper than any calculated manipulation could have. His hand finally made contact, fingers brushing her jawline with unexpected tenderness that contradicted everything she knew about his capacity for violence. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, treating her like something precious rather than another asset to be controlled. Brutus shifted position, pressing against both their legs with satisfied grunt that suggested he approved of developments, even if he couldn't articulate why. They both looked down at him, then back at each other, and Isla saw her own confusion and desire reflected in Dorian's dark eyes. The moment balanced on knife edge between professional distance and something far more dangerous. "We should focus on Carson," she said, but her words lacked conviction, heart hammering against ribs as Dorian's thumb traced her cheekbone with deliberate slowness. The suggestion felt hollow, even as she spoke it, transparent attempt to retreat from intimacy that terrified her with its intensity. Yet she didn't pull away, didn't create distance her words suggested she wanted. "Yes," he agreed, but neither of them moved, the space between them collapsing with gravitational inevitability. Neither seemed willing or able to resist. His other hand found her waist, pulling her closer with confidence that should have been presumptuous, but felt inevitable. "We absolutely should maintain professional focus on the investigation and upcoming confrontation with Carson." His lips brushed hers with question rather than demand, giving her space to retreat if she chose while making his intentions crystalline. Isla's hands found his chest, feeling his heartbeat accelerating to match her own frantic rhythm, and she made her choice by closing the remaining distance between them. The kiss deepened with mutual hunger that had been building through weeks of careful collaboration and growing trust. The warehouse Carson had chosen for the meeting sat in Philadelphia's industrial district, exactly the kind of location where questions went unasked and screams went unheard. Isla arrived 30 minutes early with Dorian, watching from a surveillance van as Carson's Mercedes pulled into the loading dock with practiced precision. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the wire hidden beneath her blouse, the tiny microphone feeling like a bomb against her skin. Dorian's security team had swept the location twice, identifying exits and potential ambush points with military efficiency she found both reassuring and terrifying. He sat beside her now, his presence radiating controlled tension as he watched Carson emerge from the vehicle alone. "If anything feels wrong, you abort immediately," he said quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "No heroics, no pushing through discomfort. Your safety matters more than any confession we might extract." She nodded, but they both knew she wouldn't retreat once the plan was in motion. Too much momentum, too many years of powerlessness driving her forward. Brutus sat at her feet, unusually alert, as if sensing the importance of what was about to unfold. His training over recent months had prepared him for exactly this scenario, though he couldn't possibly understand the justice about to be served. Carson entered the warehouse through the main door, his confidence evident in every movement as he surveyed the space he'd selected. He was younger than Isla expected, mid-30s, conventionally attractive in the way of men who relied on charm to obscure calculation. His expensive suit and casual posture suggested someone comfortable in his deception, someone who'd never seriously considered being caught. "Time to move," Dorian said, squeezing her hand once before releasing it. "Remember, you're Helena Cross, potential buyer from Boston interested in acquiring trained protection animals for your security company. Keep him talking. Let his own arrogance do the work." His eyes held hers for a long moment, conveying more than words could about his concern and trust simultaneously. Isla exited the van with Brutus on a professional lead, her stride confident despite her racing heartbeat. She dressed the part, tailored pantsuit that suggested wealth without ostentation, her hair pulled back severely to age her appearance beyond her 20 years. The transformation felt like armor, protecting her real self while the persona of Helena Cross took center stage. Carson's eyes tracked her approach with professional assessment, no flicker of recognition crossing his features. Why would there be? She'd been a child when he'd stolen Brutus, gangly and grief-stricken. Nothing like the composed woman walking toward him now. His gaze shifted to Brutus, and something predatory sparked in his expression before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "Ms. Cross, I presume." Carson extended his hand with practiced charm. "Carson Webb, Director of Security Operations. Mr. Kane speaks highly of your organization's reputation in the Boston market. I understand you're looking to expand your protection animal program with specifically trained Rottweilers." His handshake was firm without being aggressive, perfectly calibrated to establish rapport without threatening dominance. "That's correct," Isla replied, keeping her voice pitched slightly lower than natural. adding imaginary Boston accent she'd practiced for hours. "I've heard your acquisition network is unparalleled for finding animals with the right temperament and training potential. Specifically, I'm interested in understanding your sourcing methods and quality control processes." She let Brutus sit at her side, his perfect obedience a testament to their rebuilt connection. Carson's eyes lingered on Brutus with appreciation that made her stomach turn. "That's a magnificent specimen you have there. May I?" He gestured toward the Rottweiler, already reaching out before she could respond, confidence suggesting he'd handled countless dogs without consequence. "He's particular about strangers," Isla warned, but didn't stop Carson's approach. This was the moment they'd planned for, the catalyst that would reveal everything. Brutus remained perfectly still, his training overriding instinct as Carson's hand extended toward his head. The Rottweiler's lips pulled back in silent snarl, his entire body going rigid with recognition that transcended time. His eyes fixed on Carson with intensity that was unmistakably personal, not the generalized wariness of trained protection animal, but specific memory of trauma inflicted. The growl that emerged was low and promising violence, vibrating through his massive chest. Carson jerked back, surprise breaking through his professional composure. Interesting reaction. Usually takes longer for aggression to surface with proper handling. He studied Brutus more carefully now, his eyes narrowing with something that might have been recognition, beginning to surface through years of separation. "He only reacts that way to people who've hurt him before," Isla said quietly, dropping the accent and watching Carson's face for the moment of realization. "Specifically, people who stole him from his home when he was a puppy, sold him into fighting rings, and turned him into weapon instead of companion." She let the words land, each one a hammer blow against his constructed reality. Carson's expression transformed in slow motion, confusion giving way to recognition, then calculation as he assessed his exposure and options. His hand moved toward his jacket, and suddenly Dorian's security team materialized from positions Carson hadn't noticed, weapons trained with professional precision. "I wouldn't," came Dorian's voice from the warehouse entrance, his tone promising consequences beyond imagination. Dorian walked forward slowly, each step deliberate as Carson's eyes darted between exits now blocked by armed personnel. 8 years, Carson. 8 years I trusted you with everything while you built your trafficking empire using my resources, my reputation, my protection. And the beautiful irony is that the dog you sold me for $200,000, the one acquisition I authorized without question because you said he was special, turned out to be exactly right. Carson's face had gone pale, but his mind was clearly racing through explanations and escape routes. "I can explain, boss. This is misunderstanding. That dog came through legitimate channels, documented sale from Eastern European breeder. I've got paperwork proving provenance." His voice carried desperation now, the smooth charm evaporating under pressure. "The paperwork you forged," Isla said, pulling documentation from her jacket. "Like these records showing 19 other animals trafficked through your network in the last 3 years. Or these financial statements from your Cayman accounts showing over $2 million in deposits from fighting rings across 4 states. Or testimony from 3 other families whose pets disappeared and ended up in your pipeline." Her hands shook with controlled rage as she laid out evidence that couldn't be explained away. The color drained completely from Carson's face as the scope of his exposure became undeniable. He looked at Brutus again, really seeing him now beyond asset or commodity, recognizing the specific puppy he'd stolen from a balcony 7 years ago. "You're her," he said to Isla, the pieces finally connecting. "The girl from South Philly, the one with the cancer-sick mother. You grew up." "I grew up," Isla confirmed, her voice steady despite tears threatening. "And I spent 7 years thinking Brutus was dead, that whoever stole him had killed him or worse. I mourned him while finishing school, while watching my mother die, while rebuilding a life that had a hole in it, shaped exactly like the dog you took." Each word carried weight of accumulated grief, transforming into righteous fury. Dorian stepped closer to Carson, his presence radiating controlled violence that was far more terrifying than overt threat. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess everything on camera, every animal you trafficked, every family you destroyed, every dollar you stole from operations I trusted you to run legitimately. Then you're going to help me dismantle your entire network, contact every buyer, rescue every animal still in the pipeline." "And if I refuse?" Carson asked, but his voice carried no real defiance, just desperate curiosity about the consequences he already knew were coming. "Then I release this evidence to the FBI, the ASPCA, and every media outlet in 5 states, Dorian replied calmly. But not before I let it be known in the criminal world that you've been skimming from operations and selling information to federal investigators. Either way, your life as you know it ends today. The only variable is whether you maintain any shred of control over how that ending looks. The threat was delivered without emotion. Simple statement of inevitable consequences. Carson's shoulders sagged in defeat, recognizing he had no moves left to make. I want immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation. Federal witness protection, new identity, guaranteed safety from anyone I'm giving up. His attempt at negotiation was pathetic, desperate grasping at straws by someone who'd run out of options. You get to live, Dorian said flatly. That's the only guarantee I'm offering. You cooperate fully. You help rescue every animal still trapped in your network. You testify against everyone you've worked with, and in exchange, I don't let Brutus finish what his instincts are telling him to do right now. As if on cue, the Rottweiler's growl deepened, his entire focus locked on Carson with predatory intensity that promised violence if given opportunity. The recording equipment captured everything. Carson's detailed confession spanning 90 minutes, naming buyers and suppliers and middlemen across elaborate network that had destroyed countless lives for profit. Isla sat with Brutus throughout, her hand in his fur grounding them both as justice finally arrived. When Carson finished, federal agents who'd been coordinating with Dorian moved in to take custody, beginning process of dismantling operation that had flourished too long in darkness. The mansion felt different in the days following Carson's arrest, as if the exposure of betrayal had somehow purified the air itself. Isla sat in Brutus's space, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through windows Dorian had ordered enlarged, watching dust motes dance in golden beams, while the Rottweiler sprawled across her lap with contentment that seemed impossible mere months ago. The weight of his head against her thigh was solid reassurance that some things lost could be recovered, some damage healed through patience and love. Federal prosecutors had worked around the clock processing Carson's confession, and the resulting investigation had already recovered 14 animals from active trafficking operations across 3 states. Each rescue felt like small victory, but Isla couldn't shake the awareness of how many had been lost before anyone understood the scope. The numbers haunted her. Animals who'd died in fighting rings, families who'd never gotten closure, years of suffering that could have been prevented if someone had noticed Carson's deception sooner. Dorian found her there as evening shadows lengthened, his presence announced by the subtle change in Brutus's breathing rather than sound of footsteps. He'd become quieter in recent days, more contemplative, as if Carson's betrayal had forced examination of how he'd built his empire and what he'd sacrificed for power. The DA called, he said, settling beside her with unusual uncertainty in his posture. They're offering Carson 20 years in exchange for testimony against the entire network. It's not enough. It never is, Isla replied, her fingers tracing the scars on Brutus's shoulder that would never fully disappear. Justice doesn't undo damage. It doesn't give me back 7 years with Brutus. Doesn't restore him to who he might have been without the fighting rings. Doesn't resurrect my mother so I can tell her I found him. Her voice caught on the last words. Grief she'd been holding at bay finally cracking her composure. Dorian's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest with gentleness that still surprised her, despite weeks of growing intimacy. She'd been crying more lately, not from weakness but from finally feeling safe enough to release years of accumulated pain. He held her through it without trying to fix or minimize, just offering solid presence while she shook with sobs that had been building since she was 13 years old. I've been thinking about what comes next, Dorian said when her breathing had steadied, his voice rumbling through his chest into her ear. Carson's betrayal revealed holes in my organization I can't ignore. I've spent years building power through fear and control, surrounding myself with people who follow orders without question, and that very structure is what allowed someone like him to flourish right under my nose for 8 years. Isla pulled back enough to see his face, finding vulnerability there that would have been unthinkable when they first met. His eyes held genuine uncertainty, the confidence that usually defined him replaced by honest questioning of foundations he'd never examined. "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already understood the magnitude of what he was considering. "I'm saying maybe it's time to build something different," he replied, his hand finding hers with deliberate intention. "Not abandoning everything I've created, but transforming it into something that doesn't require I sacrifice my humanity to maintain. Something where loyalty is earned through integrity rather than fear. where I surround myself with people who'll challenge me when I'm wrong, rather than enable every impulse. His thumb traced circles on her palm, nervous gesture that revealed how much the admission cost him. The proposal hung between them, massive in its implications and terrifying in its vulnerability. Isla studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or tactical positioning, but found only genuine desire for transformation. "That's not a small change," she said carefully. "That's rebuilding your entire world from foundation up. Are you prepared for what that means? The resistance you'll face from people invested in current structure?" "I don't know," Dorian admitted, and the honesty was more compelling than any confident assertion could have been. "But I know that meeting you and Brutus has shown me there are things more valuable than power. Connection, trust, the ability to be gentle without being weak. You've demonstrated all of that while I watched from behind walls I built to protect myself." His free hand gestured to encompass Brutus and the transformed space around them. "If you could take this animal conditioned for violence and help him remember gentleness, maybe there's hope for me too." Brutus chose that moment to roll onto his back between them, paws in the air with complete trust that would have been impossible months ago. They both laughed despite the emotional weight of conversation, the absurdity of 130-pound Rottweiler demanding belly rubs providing necessary levity. Isla obliged, scratching his chest while considering the enormity of what Dorian was offering. "I can't be the reason you change," she said finally, needing him to understand the distinction. "Transformation has to come from internal recognition that current path isn't sustainable, not from desire to please or keep someone. If you're only changing to keep me around, you'll resent the sacrifice eventually, and we'll both end up damaged." She met his eyes directly, refusing to soften the truth. "You have to want this for yourself, to believe your life could be richer with vulnerability than it ever was with absolute control." Dorian absorbed her words with visible consideration, his expression cycling through reactions before settling into resolution. "You're right. And the truth is, I've been questioning this life longer than I've admitted to myself. Carson's betrayal was just catalyst that forced me to confront what I've been avoiding. I'm lonely, despite being surrounded by people, isolated despite my power, going through motions of existence without actually living." He paused, vulnerability making his next words emerge rough. "I've built a prison, and convinced myself it was a kingdom." The confession settled into Isla's chest with aching recognition. She'd built her own prisons over the years, walls constructed from grief and survival that had kept her safe, but also kept her from truly living. "So we're both learning to be free," she said softly, understanding that their connection was about more than romance, or even justice. Two people who've survived by building walls, trying to figure out what life looks like when we're brave enough to dismantle them. "Will you stay?" Dorian asked, and the question carried layers beyond simple living arrangements. "Not as employee or obligation, but as partner in building whatever comes next. I can't promise I'll get transformation right, can't guarantee I won't slip into old patterns or make catastrophic mistakes, but I'm asking if you're willing to navigate that uncertainty with me, to help me become someone worthy of the trust you and Brutus have placed in me." Isla felt tears threatening again, but these were different. Hope mixing with fear, possibility tangling with very real awareness of risks involved. Loving someone like Dorian meant accepting he had past that couldn't be erased, capacity for darkness that wouldn't disappear through good intentions alone. But she'd also witnessed his capacity for growth, his willingness to question himself when it would be easier to remain rigid. "I'll stay," she said, watching relief flood his features. "But I have conditions. Real partnership means you don't make unilateral decisions about things that affect us both. It means you're honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. And it means understanding that if you slide back into old patterns without acknowledging the harm, I won't enable it by staying silent or making excuses." Her voice carried steel beneath softness, making clear she wasn't offering unconditional acceptance of whatever he chose to become. Dorian nodded, respect evident in how seriously he received her terms. "I can agree to those conditions." "More than agree. I'm grateful you're setting them. I've spent too long surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, rather than what I need to know." His hand cupped her face with reverence that made her breath catch. "You challenge me to be better, and that's more valuable than any weapon Carson ever pretended to provide." The kiss that followed felt different than previous ones, less urgent passion, more profound commitment to seeing each other fully despite the risks. Brutus grumbled at being temporarily ignored, his paw batting at their legs until they broke apart laughing. The moment crystallized everything they were building. Unconventional family formed from trauma and choice. 3 beings who'd been broken, learning to be whole together. "There's something else I want to do," Dorian said as they settled back against the wall with Brutus between them. "I want to establish a sanctuary for animals rescued from trafficking operations. Proper facility with veterinary care, rehabilitation programs, adoption services for animals who can be rehomed. We'll fund it through liquidating some of my less legitimate holdings, transforming dirty money into something that actually helps." The plan emerged fully formed, suggesting he'd been considering it longer than this conversation. Isla's heart expanded at the vision he was describing, seeing how it could honor not just Brutus's suffering, but all the animals Carson and others like him had destroyed. That would be incredible. Permanent home for animals too damaged to be adopted, resources for families trying to recover stolen pets, education programs about trafficking networks. Her mind raced with possibilities. Professional experience in service work suddenly valuable in entirely new context. "I want you to help design and run it," Dorian said, his voice carrying conviction beyond simple offer. "Your experience with Brutus, your understanding of trauma and recovery, that perspective is invaluable. This can't be some wealthy person's vanity project. It needs to be built by people who understand suffering from inside, who recognize that healing isn't linear or guaranteed, but is always worth attempting." He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features. "And selfishly, I want to build something good with you, want to create, rather than just control or destroy." The vision took shape between them as night fell completely. 2 people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances planning future neither could have imagined months ago. Brutus snored softly between them, his peaceful breathing testament to transformation's reality. Outside, Philadelphia glittered with lights that could represent either continued darkness or potential for something better, depending on choices made by people brave enough to try. 3 months later, Isla stood at the entrance of Redemption Sanctuary, watching the final construction crews complete work on the rehabilitation facility that had transformed from dream to reality with stunning speed. 20 acres of Pennsylvania countryside now held state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, spacious recovery kennels, and training facilities designed specifically for animals recovering from trauma. The name had been Dorian's suggestion, recognition that redemption wasn't just for the animals, but for everyone involved in creating second chances. The grand opening was scheduled for tomorrow, but today was private preview for the team who'd made it possible. Margot had transitioned from housemaid to sanctuary administrator, her organizational skills proving invaluable in managing the complex operation. Timothy from the business office now handled fundraising and donor relations, his nervous energy channeled into productive purpose. Even some of Dorian's former security personnel had retrained as animal handlers, their protective instincts redirected toward gentler purposes. Dorian found her watching the sunset, paint the facility's main building in golden light, his arms sliding around her waist with familiarity that still sent pleasant shivers through her body. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. His transformation over recent months had been remarkable, still decisive and commanding when necessary, but tempered with humility that made his leadership more effective rather than less. "Terrified," Isla admitted, leaning into his warmth. "What if we can't help them all? What if the animals are too damaged, or we make mistakes that cause more harm, or the funding doesn't sustain long-term?" Her fears tumbled out in rush of words, vulnerabilities she'd learned to voice rather than hide. Their relationship had been built on honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. "Then we learn and adjust," Dorian replied with calm confidence she'd learned to trust. "Perfection isn't the goal. Sustained effort toward something better is what matters. We'll make mistakes. Some animals won't recover as we hope, but that doesn't negate the value of trying." His words reflected hard-won wisdom from his own transformation, from learning to accept imperfection while still striving for growth. Brutus bounded toward them across the main yard, his gait easy and joyful, in ways that would have seemed impossible during his days of violence. He'd become the sanctuary's unofficial mascot, his story of recovery inspiring donors and volunteers who saw proof that even severe damage could heal with patience and love. Other dogs now played beside him, rescues from Carson's network and other trafficking operations that had been exposed in widening investigation. The sight of Brutus playing with a young German shepherd who'd been rescued from fighting Ring just weeks ago made Isla's throat tight with emotion. The shepherd, named Hope by the intake team, had been nearly catatonic when she arrived, unresponsive to human contact and aggressive toward other animals. But Brutus had somehow reached her, his own history of trauma creating bridge where human attempts had failed. Now she romped beside him with tentative joy, learning that life could include play instead of just survival. "How many are we receiving tomorrow?" Dorian asked, watching the dogs with expression that revealed his own emotional investment in the sanctuary's success. He'd poured not just money, but genuine commitment into the project, spending weekends helping with construction and evenings reviewing rehabilitation protocols with veterinary staff. 11, Isla replied, consulting the tablet she now carried everywhere. 7 dogs, 3 cats, and 1 rabbit, all recovered from trafficking networks in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The rabbit's case is particularly heartbreaking, stolen from a children's hospital therapy program and sold to someone who wanted exotic pet without understanding proper care. Her voice hardened with anger that no longer surprised her. Injustice didn't stop hurting just because you worked actively against it. Dorian's jaw tightened, his own anger controlled but evident. The person who bought the rabbit is facing charges? The question carried edge, suggesting he'd learned details she hadn't shared. His connections in law enforcement had proven valuable in coordinating rescues, though Isla sometimes worried about methods he used to acquire information. Yes, along with the middleman who facilitated the sale, Isla confirmed. The DA is using Carson's testimony to build cases against everyone in the network. It's a slow process, but we're seeing actual accountability. Mishi paused, studying his profile in fading light. You've been different lately, more patient with the legal process. A few months ago, I think you would have handled things more directly. A few months ago I would have, Dorian admitted without shame or pride, just acknowledgement of fact. But you've taught me that sustainable change requires working within systems even when they're frustratingly slow. Vigilante justice might feel satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't create lasting transformation. He turned to face her fully, his hands finding her waist. Besides, I have things worth protecting now. This sanctuary, our relationship, the person I'm becoming. Risking those for immediate satisfaction seems foolish. The kiss that followed was interrupted by Brutus shoving his massive head between them, demanding attention with typical lack of subtlety. They laughed, including him in their embrace, while Hope watched from safe distance, still learning that affection could be trusted. The moment felt perfect in its imperfection, messy and real, complicated and beautiful, exactly what life looked like when you chose vulnerability over control. As night fell, they walked the sanctuary grounds together, Brutus and Hope trailing behind with growing pack mentality. Dorian pointed out details of the design: drainage systems to prevent flooding, soundproofing in recovery areas to reduce stress, outdoor spaces sized for different activity levels. His pride in the project was evident, transformation from man who'd built empire through fear to someone creating legacy of healing. "I've been thinking about my other businesses," Dorian said, as they reached the overlook that provided view of entire property. "Not everything I've built can or should be transformed, but there are operations I can divest from, things that cause harm even if they're profitable. I want to systematically evaluate everything and make conscious choices about what kind of empire I'm maintaining." The admission revealed ongoing internal work, recognition that change was process rather than single decision. Isla squeezed his hand, understanding the magnitude of what he was proposing. That's going to create complications. People who depend on current structures, rivals who'll see divestment as weakness, financial restructuring that might destabilize things temporarily. "Are you prepared for that resistance?" she asked, not to discourage, but to ensure he'd calculated costs realistically. "No," Dorian replied with characteristic honesty. "I'm not fully prepared, and I'll probably make significant mistakes navigating the transition. But I'm committed to trying, and I have a partner who'll tell me when I'm rationalizing harm or sliding into old patterns." His eyes found hers with intensity that still made her breath catch. "You're my conscience in many ways, Isla. Not because I've outsourced moral thinking to you, but because you model integrity. I'm still learning to embody consistently." The weight of that responsibility settled on Isla's shoulders, both honored and slightly terrified by role she'd assumed in his transformation. "Just remember, I'm human too, capable of my own blind spots and mistakes. We need to keep challenging each other, not fall into dynamic where I'm moral authority and you're supplicant seeking approval. Real partnership means we're both growing, both learning, both willing to be wrong and correct course." "Agreed," Dorian said, then pulled her close for kiss that communicated beyond words. Gratitude and desire, commitment and uncertainty, love that was choosing to be brave despite reasonable fears. When they separated, Brutus had wandered to the fence line with Hope, both dogs staring out at darkness beyond the sanctuary's boundaries with alert but calm postures. "They're guarding us," Isla observed, warmth flooding her chest at the sight. Brutus protecting the space that saved him, teaching Hope that security doesn't require violence, just presence and awareness. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. They were all learning new ways to be strong, discovering that gentleness required more courage than aggression ever had. The grand opening the next day exceeded every expectation, with donors and media coverage generating support that would sustain operations for years. Families who'd lost pets to trafficking networks toured the facilities with tears of gratitude, seeing concrete evidence that their suffering had catalyzed meaningful change. Volunteers signed up in droves, inspired by Brutus's story and the possibility of contributing to redemption rather than just witnessing tragedy. Isla gave a speech that was supposed to be brief, but became extended meditation on loss, recovery, and the choice to believe healing was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. She spoke about finding Brutus against impossible odds, about Dorian's willingness to question everything he'd built, about the animals who deserved second chances they'd never received under previous systems. Her voice cracked multiple times, but she powered through with determination that had sustained her through years of grief. Dorian stood at the back of the crowd, watching with expression that revealed pride and love in equal measure. When she finished to thunderous applause, he made his way forward and pulled her into embrace that felt like coming home. "You're remarkable," he whispered against her hair, words meant only for her despite public setting. "Everything about this, the sanctuary, the changes in my life, the hope I didn't know I needed, it all traces back to the moment you walked through that door and sang to a dog everyone said was beyond saving. We saved each other," Isla corrected, understanding that redemption had been a mutual process. Brutus brought us together, but we each made choices to believe in possibility of transformation. That's what this sanctuary represents, not just rescuing animals, but insisting that damage doesn't have to be permanent, that given proper support and genuine commitment, healing can happen even in most broken circumstances. As the evening celebration continued, Isla and Dorian slipped away to the quiet overlook where they'd stood the night before. The sanctuary glowed with lights below, symbolizing hope made tangible through collective effort and sustained commitment. Brutus and Hope joined them moments later, both dogs settling at their feet with contentment that spoke to security and belonging they'd never known before finding this place. "Thank you," Dorian said simply, his arm around Isla, as they watched their impossible dream function in reality. "For seeing past who I was to who I might become, for insisting I could be better even when I'd given up on that possibility, for building this with me when you could have just walked away with Brutus and left me to my isolated empire." His gratitude was profound, acknowledging debt that couldn't be repaid with money or grand gestures. "Thank you for being brave enough to change," Isla replied, turning in his arms to face him properly. "For choosing vulnerability over control, connection over power, transformation over comfortable stagnation. You've shown me that people really can choose differently, that damage doesn't have to define destiny permanently." She kissed him softly, promise and commitment in single gesture. "I love you, Dorian Kane, not who you were or even just who you are now, but who you're actively choosing to become every single day despite how difficult that work is." "I love you too," he replied, and the words carried weight of someone who'd never said them lightly or often. "You and Brutus have given me back my humanity, this sanctuary, our relationship, the person I see and mirror now. It's all proof that loyal love really can redeem even the most wounded souls." His reference to the sanctuary's founding principle made her smile, recognition that they'd all been wounded and were all healing together. "Thank you all for following this story of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of loyal love. If you've been moved by Isla, Dorian, and Brutus's journey, please write in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know our story reached you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support helps us continue telling stories about choosing courage over fear, vulnerability over control, and the belief that healing is always possible when we're brave enough to try.